My name is Jillian, and I stood perfectly still as the dirty laundry struck my right cheek. The 19-year-old niece of my husband, who had been living rent-free in my luxury Chicago condo for 6 months, stood before me, demanding I wash her clothes and cook her breakfast. I did not scream. I certainly did not cry. Instead, I grabbed the unwashed fabric and shoved it directly into her open, complaining mouth. My husband rushed into the kitchen, ready to throw me out of my own home, completely unaware of the devastating financial trap he had just walked into. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to put a toxic relative in their place. I am 34 and work as a forensic accountant. Growing up in the foster care system taught me early that stability was never something another person could guarantee. I spent my 20s building a career, saving carefully, and protecting the life I created. By the time I met Brian 3 years ago, I had established myself in downtown Chicago and built a home that represented years of discipline. The condo was a sprawling, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, but I rarely discussed the financial structure behind it. Privacy was second nature in my profession, and Brian showed little interest in paperwork as long as the rooms were beautiful and the bills were paid. After our wedding, he settled into the condo as though he had always belonged there. For a while, he played the role of a loving partner convincingly. He worked at a major logistics firm, drove a nice car, and spoke constantly about loyalty. Looking back, however, the cracks were always present beneath his charm and his relatives' entitlement. The real trouble began 6 months ago when the sister of Brian sent her daughter Brittany to live with us. Brittany was 19 and supposedly taking a gap year to find herself. In reality, she was taking a gap year to sleep until noon, drain our groceries, and treat my home like a 5-star hotel where she was the guest and I was the unpaid staff. Brian insisted it was just temporary, claiming that family always helps family. Since I had grown up without a traditional family, he often used my background against me, subtly suggesting I simply did not understand how real blood relatives supported one another. I tried to be accommodating. I gave Brittany the guest bedroom with the best view, stocked the fridge with expensive snacks, and tried to be a supportive aunt. But her gratitude was non-existent. It was a Tuesday morning, and the Chicago winter wind was howling against the thick glass of my condo windows. I had been awake since 5, sitting at the kitchen island with my laptop and a cooling cup of coffee. I was preparing for a high-stakes corporate audit meeting that could define the next quarter for my firm. The documents spread across the marble countertop required my absolute focus. My mind was deep in spreadsheets and financial discrepancies when the heavy thud of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Brittany marched into the kitchen. She was wearing silk pajamas that I had bought for myself, but mysteriously vanished from my closet 2 weeks prior. Her hair was piled into a messy bun, and she carried a woven laundry basket overflowing with clothes. She did not say good morning. She did not ask how I was doing. Instead, she dropped the heavy basket onto the pristine marble floor with a loud thud that made me jump. I glanced up from my laptop, trying to keep my expression neutral. She stood with her hands on her hips, staring down at me with a look of absolute disdain. "I need these washed and dried by noon," she announced, her voice dripping with the kind of unearned authority that set my teeth on edge. "Use the delicate cycle and do not shrink my cashmere sweaters like you did last time." I took a slow, deep breath, reminding myself that losing my temper would only give her ammunition. "I did not shrink your sweater, Brittany," I replied evenly, returning my gaze to my screen. "You washed it in hot water before I even got home, and I am working right now. I have a massive corporate audit meeting in 2 hours, so you will have to do your own laundry today." Brittany scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "You are always working," she whined, leaning against the counter and pulling out her phone. It is just looking at numbers on a screen. How hard can it be? Just put the clothes in the machine, and while you are up, make me avocado toast with poached eggs. I am starving. I stopped typing. The sheer audacity of her demands hung in the quiet kitchen. I looked at this girl, a healthy, capable 19-year-old adult, demanding that a woman trying to build her career stop everything to serve her. "Brittany," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm, "the washing machine is 10 feet away. The eggs are in the fridge. You live here rent-free. The least you can do is feed yourself and wash your own clothes." Her face twisted into an ugly sneer. She stepped closer to the island, invading my personal space. "You know Uncle Brian is right about you," she spat, her tone venomous. "You really do not know how to act like a real family. You just care about your stupid little job. You should be grateful we even let you play house with us. You are nothing but a glorified maid who got lucky my uncle felt sorry for you." The words hit me like a physical strike. They had been talking about me. Brian, the man who was supposed to be my partner, had been complaining about me to his spoiled teenage niece, painting me as some pathetic charity case. The anger that had been simmering inside me for 6 months finally began to boil over. I stood up from my stool, pushing my laptop aside. I was about to tell her exactly what I thought of her and her uncle, when she did the unthinkable. Brittany reached into the top of her laundry basket, grabbed a pair of unwashed, tangled underwear, and hurled it directly at my face. The dirty fabric struck my cheek before falling onto the marble counter right next to my audit reports. "Do the laundry, Jillian," she commanded, a victorious smirk spreading across her face. Time seemed to slow down. I looked at the dirty underwear resting on my financial documents. I looked at the smug, entitled teenager standing in my kitchen in my condo, wearing my pajamas. All the years of biting my tongue, of trying to be the bigger person, of wanting to prove I could be part of a normal family, evaporated in a heartbeat. I did not yell. I did not cry. I acted on pure, unadulterated instinct. I snatched the dirty underwear off the counter. Brittany opened her mouth to deliver another insult, but the words never came out. Without a second of hesitation, I lunged forward and shoved the unwashed fabric straight into her open, screaming mouth. The physical shock of the moment was absolute. Brittany stumbled backward, her eyes wide with sheer terror and disbelief. She gagged, frantically clawing at her own face to pull the dirty garment out of her mouth. She scrambled away from me, knocking over one of the heavy bar stools in her panic. The loud crash echoed through the condo, breaking the tense silence. She spit the underwear onto the floor, coughing and crying hysterically, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are crazy!" she shrieked, backing into the hallway. "You are an absolute psychopath!" I stood tall and smoothed the front of my blouse, my heart hammering while my mind sharpened into absolute clarity. "Do your own laundry," I said with cold finality. Then I turned back toward my laptop. I had stopped trying to earn Brittany's respect. From that moment forward, every word and every action inside my home would matter. The heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway belonged to my husband. Brian burst into the kitchen, his tie half knotted, and his face flushed with sudden panic. He had been getting dressed when the crashing stool interrupted his routine. He stopped, his eyes darting from the chair to Brittany, who was huddled against the wall, sobbing with dramatic breaths. Not once did his gaze linger on the dirty underwear discarded on the floor. His concern was entirely reserved for the teenager who assaulted me. "What on earth is going on in here?" Brian demanded, his voice booming through the living space. He rushed past me, ignoring my presence, and knelt beside his niece. Brittany amplified her performance. She clutched his arm, burying her face into his shirt, and pointed a trembling finger at me. "Uncle Brian!" she wailed, her voice thick with manufactured terror. I asked a simple question about the laundry and she attacked me. She shoved dirty clothes right into my mouth. She is completely insane. I stood by the kitchen island, my hands resting on the cool marble surface. I watched my husband wrap his arms protectively around a young woman who had just treated me like garbage. I waited for him to ask from my side of the story. I waited for the man I married to look his wife in the eye and ask what provoked such an extreme reaction. Instead, Brian slowly stood up, keeping one protective hand resting on the shoulder of his niece. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were devoid of affection or respect. They were cold, hard, and blazing with furious indignation. "Have you completely lost your mind?" he shouted, taking a threatening step toward me. "Are you actually insane, Jillian? She is a 19-year-old girl. You do not lay hands on a guest in this house." I kept my voice perfectly level, refusing to match his aggressive volume or his chaotic energy. "Your family just threw unwashed underwear at my face while I was preparing for a corporate audit," I replied evenly. "I simply returned her property to her. She is not a guest, Brian. She is a freeloader who treats me like a servant, and I am done tolerating it." Brian scoffed a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the condo. "You are unhinged," he spat, closing the distance between us until he was standing mere inches from my face. "You are emotionally unstable and completely out of control." He towered over me, using his physical size to try and intimidate me into submission. This was a controlling tactic I had seen glimpses of before, but never directed at me with such raw malice. "This is exactly why you have no idea how to function in a normal household." He sneered his words, carefully calculated to inflict maximum damage. "You grew up bouncing around the foster care system, living with strangers. You have absolutely no concept of what it means to be part of a real family." The mention of my childhood, a vulnerability I shared with him in our most intimate moments, being weaponized against me, was a profound betrayal. He knew exactly where to strike to cause the most pain. I stared at him, absorbing the harsh reality of the man standing before me. He was utilizing this conflict to put me in what he perceived to be my rightful place. "Blood treats blood with respect," Brian yelled, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "My sister Pamela is the absolute definition of loyalty and class. Pamela raised a daughter who understands true family values, and you just assaulted her because you are too bitter and damaged to comprehend unconditional love." I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I simply watched him unravel, noting every cruel word for future reference. "Get on your knees," Brian commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register that sent a chill down my spine. I blinked, momentarily certain I had misheard his ridiculous demand. "Excuse me?" I asked softly. "You heard me," he demanded, pointing a rigid finger at the hardwood floor beneath my feet. "You are going to get down on your knees right now, and you are going to apologize to Brittany. You are going to beg for her forgiveness for acting like an unstable psychopath, and then you are going to wash her clothes. That is the least you can do to contribute around here." The sheer absurdity of his demand hung in the tense morning air. I looked from Brian to Brittany, who had stopped crying entirely. She was leaning against the hallway wall, a triumphant, malicious smile playing on her lips. She was actively enjoying the show, reveling in the fact that her uncle was publicly humiliating me on her behalf right now. "I pay the homeowner association fees every single month," Brian continued, puffing out his chest and sweeping his arm across the luxury condo. "I am the man of this house. I maintain this incredible lifestyle. I own this home, I own this marriage, and I will not allow a nobody from nowhere to disrespect my prestigious family under my own roof." His arrogance was breathtaking. He genuinely believed that paying the monthly building fees entitled him to command my life, my dignity, and every room around us. In his mind, contribution had become ownership, and marriage had become obedience. He had repeated that fantasy so often that he no longer recognized it as a fantasy. I let him keep believing it. "I am not apologizing to anyone," I stated, my voice steady and resolute, cutting through his delusion like glass. "And I am certainly not getting on my knees for a man who defends a spoiled brat over his own wife." The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. His hands balled into tight fists. "If you will not apologize, then you can pack your bags," he roared, his voice cracking with unchecked rage. "Get your things and get out of my condo immediately. I am sick and tired of looking at you. I am sick of a nobody disrespecting my blood relatives. Leave your keys on the kitchen counter and get out before I call the police." He pointed toward the front door, his chest heaving. He thought he had delivered the ultimate punishment. He thought throwing me out into the freezing Chicago morning would break my spirit and force me to come crawling back, begging for his financial support. He thought he held all the power. I looked at the man I had vowed to spend my life with, realizing the marriage had been a complete fabrication. He did not love me. He loved the luxury and stability I provided, all while convincing himself he was the master. I did not argue, plead, or try to correct the version of reality he had built for himself. A screaming match would only waste energy and warn him that I was thinking beyond the immediate humiliation. Let him believe he had won. Let him enjoy the sight of me packing while he stood beside Brittany like a conquering hero. The betrayal was real, but my professional instincts were already pushing through the pain. I began separating emotion from evidence, insult from motive, and performance from intent. Whatever Brian was trying to accomplish by forcing me out, I intended to understand it before he realized I had started looking. I turned on my heel and walked away from the kitchen island, leaving my laptop and the scattered audit reports exactly where they were. I moved with the measured pace of a woman who had just been handed a massive puzzle and was sorting the pieces. My footsteps echoed softly against the imported hardwood floors as I made my way down the long hallway toward the master bedroom. I could hear Brian behind me, his heavy breathing a clear indication of his adrenaline. He was expecting me to turn around to beg him not to throw me out into the freezing Chicago winter. He wanted tears, apologies, and total submission. I was not going to give him a single ounce of satisfaction. I stepped into the expansive master suite. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a cold glow over the perfectly made bed. I walked straight to the closet, pulled my black suitcase from the top shelf, and laid it on the mattress. I began packing with clinical precision, avoiding sentimental items or framed photographs. I packed tailored suits for my upcoming meetings, sensible shoes, my backup hard drives, and basic toiletries. Every motion was calculated and efficient. I was treating this departure not as a tragic marital separation, but as a strategic relocation. Brian appeared in the bedroom doorway a moment later. He was leaning casually against the doorframe, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Brittany slid in right beside him, mirroring his arrogant posture. She had recovered from her earlier hysterics, and now wore a smug, victorious expression. "Look at her run," Brian mocked, his voice dripping condescension. "You always run when things get difficult, Jillian. That is your problem. You have zero staying power. The second someone demands a little respect, you pack your bags and flee. It is truly pathetic." I carefully folded a gray blazer and placed it into the suitcase, completely ignoring his taunts. My silence only seemed to embolden them further. "She probably has another apartment lined up already," Brittany chimed in. "She is used to living out of a suitcase anyway." "Right, Jillian. Did not you spend half your life bouncing around different houses? Old habits are hard to break. You just do not know how to stay in a home that belongs to a real family." Her cruelty was predictable. She was parroting the exact talking points Brian had fed her. I placed my cosmetic bag into the side compartment and smoothly zipped it closed. I did not look at them. I did not need to see their faces to know how thoroughly they were enjoying this false victory. They believed they had broken my spirit and established their supreme authority in the household. Before I grabbed the handle of my suitcase, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I needed to ensure that my digital perimeter was secure before I walked out the door. I unlocked the screen and opened an encrypted application hidden deep within a utility folder. The screen illuminated, displaying a crisp, high-definition surveillance feed. I had installed hidden microcameras in the main living areas of the condo months ago as a security measure. Now those cameras were broadcasting directly to a private server I controlled. On my screen, I could see the wide-angle view of the living room, the kitchen island, and the exact spot where the dirty underwear lay on the floor. I watched the live feed of Brian and Brittany, confirming that the audio and video capture was flawless. They were currently documenting their own hostile behavior, without even realizing it. Satisfied with my surveillance setup, I swiped over to my primary banking application. My initial intention was simply to freeze the joint credit cards and transfer my personal allowance to an isolated account as a protective measure. I tapped the screen to authenticate my secure login, waiting for the dashboard to load. When the numbers materialized on the screen, my heart stopped beating in my chest. I stood perfectly still, staring at the digital readout. Our joint high-yield savings account, where we pooled our resources for emergency funds and property taxes, was nearly empty. The balance, which had sat above $65,000 just yesterday afternoon, now displayed a meager $5,000. I quickly tapped into the transaction history, my forensic accounting instincts kicking into overdrive. There it was, sitting at the top of the ledger. A massive, unexplained withdrawal of exactly $60,000. The timestamp read 3 o'clock this morning. 3 o'clock in the morning. While I was sleeping just a few feet away from him, Brian had systematically drained our life savings. He had initiated an external wire transfer to a routing number I did not recognize. A cold, sharp realization washed over me, completely erasing any lingering feelings of marital heartbreak. This morning clash with Brittany was not a spontaneous argument. Brian defending his niece and escalating the situation to throw me out of the condo was not a sudden burst of family loyalty. It was a calculated, orchestrated distraction. He needed me out of the house. He needed me angry, emotional, and displaced so I would not notice the missing funds until the wire transfer had fully cleared the banking system. He had manufactured this entire conflict to cover his tracks. He thought I would be too busy crying in a hotel room to check the financial ledgers. He thought my grief over our shattered marriage would blind me to his theft. He had profoundly underestimated the woman he married. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. My expression remained an impenetrable mask of calm indifference. I grabbed the handle of my black suitcase and pulled it off the bed. The wheels hit the hardwood floor with a solid, satisfying click. I turned and walked directly toward the bedroom door. Brian and Brittany did not move out of the way immediately. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forcing me to stop just inches from them. "Do not expect me to answer when you call, begging to come back," Brian sneered, blocking my path. "You are leaving this marriage, Jillian. Remember that. You made this choice. You are abandoning this family because you are too arrogant to apologize. You are walking away with nothing." I looked him dead in the eye, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my shock. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice utterly devoid of emotion. Brian scoffed and shifted his weight, creating a narrow gap. I pulled my suitcase through the doorway, walking down the corridor without a backward glance. I walked to the entryway, pulled my winter coat from the closet, and slipped it on. I opened the front door and stepped out into the quiet residential hallway. I heard the lock click shut behind me. Brian had slammed the door, sealing himself inside with his victorious theft. I walked toward the elevator, my mind working 10 steps ahead. I was a forensic accountant who had just been handed the most important investigation of her career. Brian thought he had taken my money and kicked me out onto the freezing Chicago streets. He had no idea at all that by stealing from me, he had initiated his absolute ruin. I stepped into the elevator, watching the heavy metal doors slide tightly shut, sealing my path forward. The case was open, and Brian had no idea he was already its central subject. The biting wind hit my face the second I stepped out of the building. I pulled my coat tighter in the frigid morning air. A town car was idling near the curb, and I climbed into the back seat, instructing the driver to take me to a downtown hotel. I did not shed a single tear during the ride. I watched the city streets blur past the tinted windows. My mind was no longer occupied by the painful memory of my husband choosing his spoiled niece over me. That emotional wound had been cauterized the moment I saw our joint savings account drained. Now I was operating entirely on professional instinct. The lobby was a sanctuary of quiet luxury. I approached the front desk and booked a premium suite for the week, paying with a personal corporate card that Brian knew absolutely nothing about. The concierge handed me the keycard with a polite smile, completely unaware that the woman standing before him had just been evicted from her own life. I offered a tight nod and accepted the key. The normalcy of the hotel was a stark contrast to the chaos I had just escaped. I rode the elevator to the 12th floor and walked to my suite. The room featured sweeping views of the Chicago skyline, but I had no interest in the amenities. I walked straight to the mahogany desk in the corner. I set my suitcase down and pulled out my laptop external hard drives and an encrypted mobile hotspot. I arranged my equipment with precision. My hands did not tremble. The adrenaline pumping through my veins had crystallized into a state of hyper-focused awareness. I sat down in the leather chair and opened the laptop. I was a senior forensic accountant, and for the last 8 years, corporations had paid my firm exorbitant hourly rates to track down missing funds and dismantle financial frauds. My career was built on the fundamental truth that money always leaves a trail. People lie, manipulate, and delete emails, but numbers never lie. They simply wait to be properly understood. I connected to my secure virtual private network, establishing a digital perimeter that Brian could never trace. I logged back into our primary banking portal and pulled up the detailed transaction ledger for our joint savings account. I needed to isolate the exact pathway of the $60,000 withdrawal that had taken place at 3 o'clock in the morning. I clicked on the transaction ID, expanding the metadata associated with the wire transfer. Brian was a logistics manager, not a financial expert. He understood supply chains and shipping routes, but he did not understand the intricate architecture of modern banking. He assumed that a wire transfer was a simple black box where money went in one end and safely disappeared out the other. I copied the destination routing number and pasted it into a specialized database I utilized for corporate audits. The search results populated instantly. The initial receiving account did not belong to Brian personally. It belonged to a limited liability company registered in Delaware. I accessed the state business registry and pulled the formation documents for the LLC. The company had been established exactly 4 months ago. The registered agent was a third-party corporate service, a standard tactic to mask the true ownership of an entity. But Brian had made a critical mistake. When he set up the initial funding to open the Delaware LLC, he used a credit card tied to his own personal email address. It was a digital fingerprint left right at the scene of the crime. I leaned closer to the screen, scanning the financial routing data. I was no longer a betrayed wife, reeling from a morning of verbal abuse. I was a predator, tracking my prey through the digital wilderness. I cross-referenced the Delaware LLC with our joint tax returns from the previous year, utilizing specialized forensic software that maps out financial connections. The software began to untangle the web Brian had attempted to weave. The $60,000 had not stayed in the Delaware account for more than 10 minutes. It had been chopped into 3 separate transactions of $20,000 each. This is a classic money laundering technique known as smurfing, designed to avoid triggering automatic flags for large single transfers. I tracked the first $20,000 block. It had been routed through a secondary holding account at a Midwestern credit union. From there, it was bounced to a digital payment processing platform, scrambling the direct origin of the funds. I tracked the second and third blocks, watching them follow similarly convoluted paths. Brian had clearly spent weeks researching how to hide money, reading online forums, or taking advice from someone who thought they were clever. But he lacked the sophistication to execute it flawlessly. I pulled the raw data logs from the digital payment processor, exploiting a back-end vulnerability I had mapped during a previous corporate audit. The 3 separated blocks of money converged again at a final destination. I stared at the name of the receiving institution, feeling a cold smile spread across my face. The final destination was an offshore holding account located in the Cayman Islands. It was an account structure explicitly marketed to high-net-worth individuals looking to shield assets from domestic legal scrutiny. Brian had funneled our life savings entirely out of the United States banking jurisdiction. He deliberately moved the money into an offshore account to ensure it would be completely inaccessible during a standard domestic divorce proceeding. He engineered this entire morning to fight the defense of his niece, the sudden eviction, because he needed me out of the condo before I realized the assets were gone. He was planning to blindside me with divorce papers while I was still trying to figure out where I was going to live. He wanted me desperate broke and scrambling for a lawyer I could not afford to hire. He wanted to drain my resources so thoroughly that I would be forced to accept whatever meager settlement he offered just to survive. I leaned back in the heavy leather desk chair, resting my chin on my folded hands. The sheer audacity of his plan was almost impressive, but it was flawed. Brian believed he had outsmarted me because he viewed my career as just looking at numbers on a screen. He had no concept of the specialized tools, federal databases, and deep industry connections I had at my disposal. I opened a new secure document on my laptop and began drafting a comprehensive forensic timeline. I logged every timestamp, every routing number, every IP address associated with the transfers, and the exact ownership structure of the Delaware Shell Company. I was meticulously building an evidentiary file that would stand up in any federal court. I poured myself a glass of iced water from the minibar, my mind racing through the implications. The $60,000 was significant, but it was just our liquid savings. Brian was arrogant, but he was also greedy. If he went through the trouble of establishing an offshore holding account and a Delaware Shell Company, he was not going to stop at $60,000. The financial infrastructure he had built was designed to handle a much larger volume of cash. I tapped my fingers against the mahogany desk, letting the pieces of the puzzle shift and realign. There had to be a larger payout. He was setting the stage for something massive, something that would require him to have absolute, unquestioned control over our finances and my living situation. He kicked me out of the condo today for a very specific reason, and I needed to know exactly what he was expecting to happen next. I took one final sip of my iced water and placed the glass gently onto a coaster. I cracked my knuckles, rolled my shoulders back, and turned my attention to the glowing laptop screen, ready to dig deeper into the digital shadows he thought he had so cleverly secured. My next step was establishing a baseline of liabilities. I had already uncovered the $60,000 Brian siphoned into the Cayman Islands. However, a man like my husband does not build an offshore financial structure just to hide a modest sum. He needed something massive to fill it. I opened a direct portal to the 3 major credit bureaus. Because we shared a residential address, I possessed all the necessary credentials to initiate a credit inquiry on his profile. I authorized the pull and watched the loading bar inch across my screen. The report generated a moment later, detailing his credit cards, auto loans, and recent inquiries. I scrolled past the standard monthly obligations, my eyes scanning the active alerts section. A hard inquiry had been placed on his credit file just 48 hours ago. The requesting institution was not our standard commercial bank. It was a notoriously aggressive online lending company that specialized in rapid approval, high-risk mortgages. My brow furrowed as I processed the name of the lender. Brian had absolutely no reason to seek a mortgage. We had no plans to move, and he certainly did not have the capital to purchase investment properties on his own. I highlighted the lender name and ran a secondary search through the email server cache I had backed up from our shared home network. I found the communication thread buried in a heavily nested folder Brian had labeled as corporate logistics. He had manually diverted all emails from this specific lending domain to bypass his primary inbox, so I would never see the notifications flash on his phone. I bypassed the password protection on the attached PDF files. The document illuminated on my screen, and the sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over me all over again. It was a formal loan application for a cash-out refinance. Brian was attempting to extract $250,000 in pure liquid cash. He was using the equity of a luxury property as his personal automated teller machine. I read through the terms of the underwriting agreement. The loan was in the final stages of approval. The predatory lender required minimal verification, utilizing automated valuation models to expedite the funding process. They were prepared to wire $250,000 directly into the very same domestic bank account that Brian had just used as a launching pad for his offshore money laundering scheme. He needed me out of the condo today because the loan required a recorded video verification to finalize the disbursement. He could not risk me overhearing that phone call. He needed the condo empty to play the undisputed master of the domain while securing his payout. I clicked to the final page of the loan application where the borrower signatures were required. My breath hitched slightly in my throat as I looked at the bottom of the digital document. There, right next to the electronic signature of Brian, was my own name. He had forged my digital signature. He had checked the boxes verifying my consent, my financial standing, and my agreement to leverage the property. I leaned back in the hotel chair, shaking my head at the absolute absurdity of his actions. Brian possessed a dangerous combination of unearned confidence and profound ignorance. He had spent the last 3 years genuinely convincing himself that he owned the luxury Chicago condo we lived in. His delusion was rooted in a profound misunderstanding of property law. When we first moved in together, we agreed to split the living expenses to maintain financial partnership. I allowed him to take over the monthly homeowner association fees and the utility bills. In his mind, paying $1,000 a month for building maintenance and electricity equated to full legal ownership of a property worth nearly $2 million. He truly believed that because his name was on the electric bill, the real estate automatically defaulted to marital property. He assumed that since we were married, the law would just naturally recognize him as the primary stakeholder. He had weaponized this belief against me just hours ago, standing in the kitchen and screaming that he owned the home and owned our marriage. He thought he was mortgaging an asset that rightfully belonged to him. He thought he was outsmarting a woman he viewed as nothing more than a glorified calculator. But Brian had made a fatal, catastrophic error. He had never actually seen the property deed. If he had conducted a public records search, he would have realized that neither of our names appeared anywhere on the county property register. 2 years before I ever met Brian, I made the largest financial decision of my life. Growing up in the foster care system instilled in me a desperate need for absolute security. When I finally saved enough money from my early forensic accounting contracts, I did not just buy a condo. I built an impenetrable fortress. I purchased the property entirely in cash. There was no original mortgage, no banknote, and no lingering debt. But more importantly, I did not purchase it under the name Jillian. I hired a highly specialized asset protection attorney to carefully establish an irrevocable blind trust. My identity as the sole beneficiary was completely shielded from public view. The legal owner of the luxury condo was the trust itself, represented on paper by a third-party corporate trustee. When Brian and I married, I deliberately chose not to commingle this specific asset. I never added him to the trust, and I never transferred the deed. The property was legally insulated from any claim of marital asset division. By forging my signature on that loan application, Brian had not just committed a minor marital deception. He submitted fraudulent legal documents to a regulated financial institution to leverage an asset he did not own. He had crossed the line from being a terrible husband into becoming a federal criminal. Mortgage fraud and wire fraud can carry severe federal penalties. The aggressive online lender pushed the application through to the final stages because the property had zero existing debt. But the moment their automated system attempted to execute the final lien against the property deed, the glaring discrepancy between the forged signature and the actual corporate trustee would trigger an immediate, catastrophic failure. The bank would instantly flag the transaction as a high-level fraud attempt. I sat in the quiet hotel room, staring at the forged signature on my screen. A profound sense of calm settled over me, replacing the last lingering traces of shock. Brian had orchestrated the perfect morning to throw me out onto the street, believing he was clearing the runway to steal $250,000. He thought he was securing his financial independence and funding the lavish lifestyle his sister and niece demanded. He had no idea that the very home he tried to steal was a fortified legal trap. He had woven a noose out of his own greed and placed it directly around his own neck. He handed me the exact documentation I needed to ensure he would not just lose his marriage, but lose his freedom entirely. I calmly saved the forged loan application to a highly encrypted external drive, securing the absolute evidence that would guarantee his complete destruction. The foundation of his life was already crumbling. He just had not felt the solid ground completely drop beneath his arrogant feet yet. The sudden vibration of my cell phone against the mahogany desk shattered the quiet concentration of the hotel room. The caller identification displayed the name Pamela. She was the sister of Brian and the mother of the entitled teenager who started this morning of chaos. A notification pinged to alert me that a new audio message had been recorded. I picked up the phone and pressed play. Her voice came through the device in a shrill, ear-piercing shriek. "You are an absolute monster, Jillian. Brittany called me crying because you physically assaulted her. I am calling the police to press charges against you. I demand $10,000 transferred to me by tonight to cover her trauma therapy. If you do not pay me, I will make sure you are locked in a jail cell." I listened to her unhinged rant, keeping my expression neutral. The threat of police action was an empty intimidation tactic. If they actually wanted to call the authorities, they would have done it from the condo. Pamela was just utilizing the situation to attempt a blatant cash grab. But the next part of her voicemail made my analytical mind suddenly freeze and pay sharp attention. "You are a worthless nobody," Pamela continued, her tone shifting to condescending smugness. "Thank God my brother finally kicked you out onto the street, where you belong. He just promised to fully fund a luxury European vacation for Brittany to help her recover from the trauma you caused. We do not need you, Jillian. Enjoy your miserable, lonely life." The voicemail ended with a sharp click. My mind was spinning at a frantic pace. Something about that voicemail did not make logical financial sense. I am a forensic accountant, and I notice when the mathematical equation of a situation is broken. Pamela owned a high-end boutique clothing store in the suburbs. Brian and I had discussed it several times over the last year because her business was actively failing. She lived far beyond her means, trying to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth while her retail business bled money. She was financially desperate. Brian had just drained our joint savings of $60,000 and was desperately trying to secure a fraudulent cash-out refinance for $250,000. But those funds were clearly meant to build his offshore safety net. Funding a luxury European vacation for a teenager did not fit his financial profile. A luxury trip across Europe would cost at least $20,000. How could a logistics manager possibly promise to fully fund a lavish overseas vacation for his niece on the very same day he was scrambling to steal from our home equity? The pieces of the puzzle were colliding in my head. There was a missing stream of revenue. Brian and Pamela were operating with a level of financial arrogance that suggested they had access to a continuous flowing source of untraceable cash. I opened a new secure browser window on my laptop. When I was preparing our annual joint tax returns, I had requested full access to all of his corporate financial portals. I needed his expense accounts and his corporate reimbursement logs to ensure our tax filings were completely accurate. Brian handed over his login credentials because he was too lazy to organize the paperwork himself. He never changed the password. I navigated to the employee portal of his corporate logistics firm and entered his credentials. The system authenticated my login without triggering any secondary alerts. I bypassed his standard employee profile and navigated directly to his departmental expense and vendor payment logs. Brian was a senior logistics manager. His primary role involved approving vendor contracts for independent freight contractors. He had authority to approve invoices up to $50,000 without requiring a secondary signature. I exported his entire vendor approval history for the last 18 months into a massive raw data spreadsheet. I opened my specialized forensic analysis software and fed the raw data into the system. I instructed the software to isolate any vendor payments that were approved directly by Brian and paid out to newly established companies. The software processed the data in a matter of seconds. The screen populated with a list of 7 different vendor companies. They all had generic names associated with shipping operations: Midwest Freight Solutions, Great Lakes Logistics, Apex Shipping Partners. I clicked on the first vendor name and pulled the corporate registration data from the state database. The company had been registered exactly 14 months ago. I scanned down to the registered agent and the primary business address. The blood ran completely cold in my veins. The business address listed for the independent freight contractor was not a warehouse. It was the exact street address of the failing high-end suburban clothing boutique owned by Pamela. I clicked on the second vendor name. The address was a post office box located 2 blocks away from the home of Pamela. I clicked on the third vendor. The registered agent was a subsidiary company that I easily traced straight back to the maiden name of Pamela. The horrific reality of what I was looking at settled heavily over my shoulders. Brian was not just a terrible husband who tried to steal our savings. He was the architect of a massive corporate embezzlement ring. He was using his authority at the logistics firm to generate fake invoices for ghost shipments. He was approving those fraudulent invoices and routing the funds directly into shell companies controlled entirely by his sister Pamela. Pamela was then running that stolen corporate money through the registers of her failing boutique. She was claiming the stolen cash as legitimate retail revenue, washing it clean, and paying taxes on it. She was laundering the money. Once clean, she funneled a portion back to the offshore accounts and kept the rest. I stared at the screen, my hands resting perfectly still on the keyboard. This was why Brian was so incredibly arrogant. This was why Pamela felt untouchable. They believed they had constructed a flawless financial pipeline that no one would ever discover. They thought they were criminal masterminds, but they had made the ultimate mistake. They had invited a senior forensic accountant into their family, treated her like absolute garbage, and then handed her the exact keys needed to unlock their entire illicit empire. The stakes of this conflict had just escalated far beyond a simple domestic dispute over a luxury condo or a drained savings account. This was no longer just about a bad marriage. By cross-referencing these shell companies, I realized Brian was actively siphoning money from a major corporation and laundering it across state lines. This was a multi-million-dollar money laundering operation. It was a serious federal crime that could expose them to substantial prison time. I picked up my cell phone and looked at the saved voicemail from Pamela. She wanted to threaten me with the police over a fabricated assault. She had no idea that I was currently compiling a digital dossier that I would personally hand-deliver to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I took a deep breath. I needed to ensure that every single piece of evidence was undeniable. I reached for my coffee cup, taking a slow sip as I began drafting the executive summary of their federal indictment. Their entire fraudulent world was about to burn to the ground. I was ready to deliver the final blow. The hotel room was quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of my fingers against the keyboard. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously compiling every digital trace of the corporate embezzlement and money laundering scheme into a secure, encrypted file. But as I reviewed the mountain of evidence, I realized something crucial was missing. Digital footprints and offshore routing numbers were powerful, but they were not enough to guarantee an airtight federal conviction without physical corroboration. I needed direct access to the local hard drive of his corporate laptop. I needed the localized cache files, the unencrypted chat logs, and the internal memo drafts he had saved directly to his physical machine. The kind of data that never touched the cloud. To acquire that level of undeniable proof, I could not stay hidden in a luxury hotel suite. I had to go back into the lion den. I had to swallow my pride, put on the performance of a lifetime, and return to the luxury condo. I needed to become the exact woman Brian thought I was, a broken, submissive wife, desperate to save a failing marriage. I closed my laptop and packed my equipment back into my black suitcase. I checked out of the hotel, paying the balance in cash to leave no immediate trail. The ride back to the condo felt entirely different from my departure. I was no longer a woman reeling from betrayal. I was an undercover operative stepping into a hostile environment. I stood outside the heavy oak door of my own home and took a slow, deliberate breath. I let my shoulders slump forward slightly, altering my posture to project defeat. I arranged my facial features into a mask of exhaustion and regret. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The scent of expensive takeout food filled the entryway. I walked into the main living room and found Brian lounging on the custom sectional sofa. He had his feet propped up on the glass coffee table, a half-empty beer in his hand, and the television blaring a sports game. Brittany was sprawled across the other end of the couch, scrolling mindlessly through her phone. The moment they heard the click of my suitcase wheels rolling across the hardwood floor, they both froze and turned toward me. Brian slowly lowered his beer to the table. A slow, incredibly smug smile spread across his face. He leaned back against the cushions, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked like a king greeting a rebellious peasant who had finally succumbed to starvation. "I knew you would not last a full day out there," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have nowhere else to go, Jillian. You do not have any real friends, and you certainly do not have any family to run to." I knew the moment the cold Chicago air hit your face, you would realize just how good you have it here with me. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, playing the part of the defeated spouse perfectly. I let a calculated tremble enter my voice as I spoke. "I am sorry, Brian," I said softly. "I was overwhelmed, and I reacted badly this morning. I should not have let my work stress affect how I treat your family." Brian let out a harsh, triumphant laugh. He stood up from the couch and walked slowly toward me, closing the distance until he was standing uncomfortably close. He looked down at me, his eyes filled with a terrifying mix of arrogance and contempt. "You really thought you could just walk out on me?" he mocked, shaking his head. "You thought you could disrespect my blood relatives in my own house, and I would just let it slide? You are lucky I am a generous man, Jillian. Most husbands would have changed the locks and left your belongings out on the curb for the garbage collectors." I nodded slowly, keeping my gaze submissive. "I appreciate you letting me come back," I whispered, hating the taste of the lie in my mouth, but knowing it was absolutely necessary for the larger plan. Brian scoffed and pointed a rigid finger toward the couch, where his teenage niece was watching the exchange, with undisguised glee. "I am not the one you need to be begging for forgiveness," he stated coldly. "You assaulted my niece. You humiliated her in this house. If you want to sleep in my bed tonight, you are going to walk over there and apologize to Brittany. And you are going to mean it." I turned slowly toward the living room. Brittany sat up straighter, adjusting her posture to look as regal and commanding as possible. She crossed her legs and folded her arms, mimicking the aggressive body language of her uncle. She was 19 years old, but in that moment she carried the cruelty of a seasoned tyrant. This was her ultimate fantasy coming true. The successful career woman she deeply resented was being forced to bow down to her. I walked over to the edge of the sectional sofa. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to tell her exactly what a miserable little parasite she was. But I thought about the forged loan documents. I thought about the federal indictment I was currently building. I swallowed my pride, pushing the anger deep down into a locked compartment in my mind. "Brittany?" I began, my voice carefully modulated to sound contrite and small. "I am incredibly sorry for my behavior this morning. I lost my temper and I acted in a way that was completely unacceptable. You are a guest in our home, and I failed to treat you with the respect you deserve. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me for overreacting." Brittany stared at me for a long moment, letting the silence stretch out to maximize my humiliation. She looked me up and down, taking in my slumped posture and my lowered eyes. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "You know, Jillian, you really are unhinged," she said, her tone laced with pure venom. "You shoved dirty underwear into my mouth, just because I asked you to do a simple household chore. Normal people do not act like that. My mother is right about you." "You are completely broken inside." I dug my fingernails into the palms of my hands, hiding the physical reaction behind the folds of my winter coat. "I am sorry," I repeated softly. Brittany exchanged a look with Brian, who was nodding approvingly from the center of the room. She turned her attention back to me, a malicious spark lighting up her eyes. "An apology is just words, Jillian," she stated haughtily. "If you are actually sorry, you need to prove it. My mother is coming over this Sunday to check on me because she was extremely traumatized to hear about how you attacked me. Since you clearly do not know how to act like a proper host, you are going to make up for your psychotic behavior by cooking a massive feast for the entire extended family this coming Sunday." I blinked, feigning surprise at the sudden demand. "A feast for the whole family?" I asked, keeping my tone hesitant. "Yes, a massive feast," Brian declared, standing beside her, knowing Sunday would be the absolute perfect stage for their ultimate destruction. I slowly lowered my eyes and agreed. Over the next 4 days, I maintained the performance Brian wanted to see. I rose before dawn, prepared breakfast, answered Brittany's demands with quiet obedience, and kept the condo orderly enough to convince them that my resistance had vanished. Brittany tested the new arrangement constantly. She abandoned dishes in the living room, emptied expensive products from my bathroom, invited friends over without asking, and left online shopping boxes stacked beside the door for me to break down. Each time she ordered me to clean up, I lowered my eyes and complied, while memorizing the rhythm of the household. Brian encouraged every small humiliation because it confirmed the story he wanted to believe. He came home expecting a drink, a hot meal, and my complete attention. He tossed his coat over chairs, left confidential papers inside his open briefcase, and spoke freely about money whenever he thought I was too defeated to listen. I never challenged him. I used the repetition to make myself invisible. The more comfortable they became, the less careful they were. By the middle of the week, Brian no longer carried his corporate laptop with him from room to room, and Brittany stopped lowering her voice when she discussed Pamela's plans. Their contempt was exhausting, but it was also useful. Every demand brought me closer to the evidence I had returned to collect. By Wednesday, the situation escalated from domestic disrespect to outright invasion. Brian invited his sister Pamela to start coming over every afternoon to keep an eye on things while he was at work. Pamela arrived the first day carrying an oversized designer handbag and an unearned sense of supreme authority. She was a woman who draped herself in expensive brands to mask the fact that her retail business was bleeding cash. The moment she stepped through the front door, she did not even bother to greet me. She simply walked past me into the living room, pulled a metal tape measure out of her bag, and began aggressively measuring the dimensions of my home. I stood by the kitchen island, watching in silent fascination as she marched from the living room to the dining area, snapping the metal tape measure against the baseboards. She was loudly narrating her plans to completely gut and redecorate the entire space. "This dark wood flooring is incredibly depressing," she announced to the empty room, scribbling notes onto a legal pad. "We are going to rip all of this out and install wide plank French oak. And this kitchen island is an absolute disaster. The marble is too cold. We need warm quartz and pendant lighting that actually makes a statement." Brittany emerged from her bedroom, munching on a piece of toast I had made for her earlier. She leaned against the refrigerator, pointing her half-eaten toast at my custom cabinetry. "Can we please get rid of the terrible modern art pieces?" she whined. "They give me a headache. We need something more elegant." "Oh, definitely, sweetie," Pamela agreed, reeling in her tape measure with a loud metallic clatter. Uncle Brian promised that as soon as his massive executive bonus clears this weekend, we are hiring my personal interior designer to overhaul the entire place. He says we have a budget of at least $100,000 just for the renovations. It is going to be spectacular. I kept my expression completely blank as I listened to her outline how she planned to spend the fraudulent loan money Brian was currently attempting to steal from my property equity. They were actively measuring my condo for renovations, using funds they believed they were extracting from my own hidden trust. The sheer, staggering audacity of their greed was almost difficult to comprehend. They were entirely counting on chickens that were never going to hatch. I walked over to the built-in wine fridge and pulled out a bottle of expensive chilled Chardonnay. I retrieved 2 crystal glasses from the cabinet and approached them in the living room, playing the role of the obedient broken wife, attempting to earn their favor. I poured the pale yellow liquid into the glasses and offered them to the 2 women, who were currently plotting to dismantle my sanctuary. Pamela accepted the glass without a word of thanks. She took a slow sip, her eyes scanning my face with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. "You know Jillian," she said, her voice dropping to a conversational but deeply condescending tone. "I really do not blame you for having such atrocious taste in home decor. It is not entirely your fault." I offered a small, submissive smile, waiting for the insult I knew was coming. People from nowhere never really understand how to treat real blood relatives or how to build a proper home. Pamela continued taking another sip of her wine. "Brian told me all about your background in the foster care system, bouncing around from stranger to stranger, never having a real foundation. It explains so much about your erratic behavior and your inability to prioritize family. You simply lack the pedigree. You are incredibly lucky Brian has such a big heart." He lets you stay here, in this gorgeous building, even after you assaulted his niece. Most men would have left you out on the street to fend for yourself. I kept my smile perfectly intact. You are absolutely right, Pamela, I said, my voice soft and deferential. I am very lucky to have Brian. I do not know where I would be without this family. Pamela smirked, exchanging a victorious glance with Brittany. See that you remember that, she stated coldly, turning her attention back to her legal pad. Now be a dear and go fetch the cheese board I brought. Talking about renovations always makes me hungry. Of course, I replied, turning away from them. As I walked back toward the kitchen, the sound of their laughter echoed through the open living space. They were toasting to their impending wealth, celebrating their dominance over the pathetic foster kid. I walked past the kitchen island and slipped quietly down the hallway toward the master suite. Brian had converted the second guest bedroom into his home office, a space he strictly forbade me from entering. The door was closed but not locked. I pushed it open silently and stepped inside the dimly lit room. His corporate laptop was sitting on the heavy oak desk, plugged into the docking station and humming quietly. Brian was arrogant enough to leave his machine in sleep mode, assuming his physical presence in the condo was security enough. He never logged out of his active sessions. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a small, black USB interceptor drive. This was not a standard storage device. It was a highly specialized piece of forensic hardware designed to bypass basic security protocols and instantly clone the local directory of a target machine. I needed the raw, unfiltered data that lived exclusively on his physical hard drive. I needed the unencrypted chat logs, the downloaded PDF invoices from his fake shell companies, and the localized cache files that would prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that he was actively orchestrating the embezzlement from this very desk. I plugged the interceptor directly into the high-speed port on the side of his laptop. A tiny green LED light blinked to life on the side of the drive, indicating that the automated cloning script had successfully initiated. I stood perfectly still in the quiet office, listening to the faint, muffled sounds of Pamela and Brittany laughing in the living room down the hall. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs. I watched the progress bar on the tiny digital display screen of the interceptor fill up, block by block. Every passing second was pulling thousands of files, extracting the absolute proof of his multi-million-dollar federal crimes. The green light shifted to a solid, steady blue. The cloning process was complete. I smoothly unplugged the drive and slipped it securely back into the deep pocket of my cardigan. I left the laptop exactly as I had found it, ensuring the mouse and cables were perfectly aligned. I stepped out of the office and walked back to the kitchen, pulling the artisanal cheese board from the refrigerator. I arranged the crackers with practiced care, my hands steady and my breathing relaxed. I carried the heavy wooden board out to the living room, setting it gently on the glass coffee table before the two women who thought they had defeated me. I poured them another glass of wine, smiling as they continued to measure my walls, completely oblivious to the fact that I was currently holding the digital keys to their federal prison cells right inside my pocket. The following morning, I continued to play the role of the broken and defeated wife, right up until the moment I walked out the front door for my lunch break. I had spent the early hours scrubbing the kitchen grout just to keep Brian and Brittany satisfied with my performance. But the moment I stepped onto the busy Chicago sidewalk, my entire demeanor shifted. I straightened my posture, pulled my tailored coat tightly around myself, and hailed a cab to the financial district. The crisp air felt invigorating against my skin, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of my own home. My destination was a sleek glass skyscraper that housed one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms in the entire city. I bypassed the main reception desk entirely. The security guards knew me by face and simply nodded as I swiped my access card to reach the executive elevators. I was going to see Mitchell, a senior partner whom I had collaborated with on several massive fraud investigations over the last 5 years. Mitchell was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who dismantled corrupt executives for a living and actually enjoyed the process. I stepped out of the elevator and walked directly into his corner office without knocking. Mitchell was standing by his floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over Lake Michigan with a cup of black coffee in his hand. He turned around when he heard my heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor. He took one look at my expression and immediately walked over to his heavy mahogany desk. He did not offer small talk or ask how my day was going. He knew that if I was showing up unannounced in the middle of a Thursday afternoon, something monumental was happening. I reached into my coat pocket and placed the small black Interceptor drive in the center of Mitchell's immaculate desk. The device looked harmless, but the directory inside it contained the local files Brian had assumed would never leave his office. I asked Mitchell to open it inside an isolated review environment and preserve a verified copy before examining anything. He disconnected a secondary workstation from the firm's primary network, documented the device, and created a read-only image of the contents. The process mattered. I did not want Brian's attorneys arguing later that files had been altered after collection. When the clone directory appeared, I gave Mitchell a concise timeline instead of repeating every discovery. I showed him the forged refinance application, the destination account for the $60,000 transfer, and the spreadsheet linking Brian's approved vendors to Pamela's boutique. Then I directed him to the material that had not appeared in the cloud records, draft invoices, locally saved messages, and a folder of payment schedules organized by vendor name. Several messages discussed splitting transfers into smaller amounts and described Pamela's store as the place where the money would be made clean. Brian had even saved a draft calendar identifying dates when his approval authority would face the least internal scrutiny. Mitchell's expression changed as he moved from file to file. He cross-referenced the vendor names against a restricted litigation database and asked me to confirm Brian's position at the logistics firm. I explained that Brian could approve independent freight invoices up to $50,000 without a second signature. Mitchell turned one monitor toward me. A confidential notice showed that regulators had already been examining unexplained losses at the same company for 4 months. Personal auditors knew money was leaving regional shipping budgets, but they had not identified the person connecting the false vendors. "Your husband did not create a separate mystery," Mitchell said. "He created the missing map for an investigation that already exists." That was the new fact I needed. The evidence was no longer just my private reconstruction of Brian's conduct. It matched a documented pattern his employer and federal investigators had already been trying to isolate. Mitchell marked the vendor files, the local messages, and the boutique transfers for immediate preservation. He separated the mortgage documents from the corporate evidence so the lender's fraud team and the white-collar investigators could evaluate their respective cases without contaminating the chain of custody. He also warned me that the original device would need to be surrendered through counsel and that I should not access Brian's company systems again. Only then did I explain the Sunday dinner and Brian's plan to announce the loan proceeds in front of his family. Mitchell listened without interrupting. When I finished, he began preparing a formal referral package and contacting the appropriate investigators. We would not manufacture a crime, alter a transaction, or promise an arrest before authorities reviewed the evidence. We would allow Brian to complete the steps he had already chosen while the lender protected its funds and investigators documented where he attempted to send them. Mitchell told me to return home, preserve the recordings, and avoid provoking Brian. The final move had to remain entirely his. Mitchell opened a secure communication portal and attached the preserved summaries, not the raw drive, to an initial referral for the white-collar investigators already assigned to the logistics inquiry. He also contacted counsel for the lender, so its fraud team could compare Brian's signature, the trust ownership records, and the proposed destination accounts. The two matters were related, but Mitchell insisted they remain documented separately until the investigators formally connected them. That distinction would prevent Brian from claiming that a private marital dispute had contaminated the corporate case. No one promised me that agents would arrive on a schedule designed for dramatic satisfaction. Mitchell explained that investigators would first confirm the evidence, obtain the necessary legal authority, and decide whether Brian's next transfer attempt justified immediate action. What we could control was preservation. The condo cameras would record his statements. The bank would retain every instruction he issued. The files from his laptop would remain sealed with a verified hash. If he announced the loan and attempted to route the proceeds during dinner, the government would have his own words and actions instead of merely my interpretation. I told Mitchell that Brian expected the money to appear on Sunday evening and had ordered me to serve the entire extended family. He considered the timing, then gave me a secure phone and a simple protocol. I was not to confront Brian before the account alert appeared. I was not to touch his phone, move money, or encourage him to send it anywhere. I would confirm only what I directly witnessed. If Brian became violent, I was to leave immediately and call local police rather than protect the operation. By the time I stood to leave, the evidence had moved beyond my private laptop and into formal channels. Mitchell would handle the lawyers and investigators. My role was to return to the condo, maintain the illusion that I had surrendered, and let Brian reveal himself. For the first time since Tuesday morning, I no longer felt as though I was carrying the entire case alone. The commute home felt short. The winter wind felt refreshing against my cheeks. I walked through the lobby and rode the private elevator up to my floor. When I unlocked the door, the condo was unusually quiet. The constant, chaotic noise Brittany usually generated was absent. I hung my coat and walked into the kitchen, tying my apron. I pulled fresh ingredients from the refrigerator and began prepping dinner. I chopped vegetables, moving with a calm rhythm. The knowledge of Sunday acted as a shield, protecting my mind from the degrading reality of my situation. I was no longer a trapped victim. I was the architect of their downfall, waiting for the concrete to set. Around 6 o'clock, the front door swung open, and Brian walked inside. He did not take off his boots before stepping onto the hardwood floors. He threw his briefcase onto the kitchen island next to my cutting board. He looked incredibly pleased with himself. His chest was puffed out, projecting the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had conquered the financial world. He loosened his tie and let out a dramatic sigh of satisfaction. He walked around the island and stood directly in my personal space. I kept my head down, focusing entirely on dicing a pepper. I did not want him to see the triumphant spark dancing in my eyes. "Jillian," he said, his moderation loud and commanding. "Put the knife down and look at me when I am speaking to you." I set the chef knife onto the cutting board and slowly raised my head. I arranged my facial features into a mask of passive obedience. "Yes, Brian," I replied softly. He leaned against the marble counter, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked me up and down, evaluating my domestic performance with a smug sense of ownership. "I need you to completely clear your schedule for this weekend," he ordered. "You are going to spend all day tomorrow deep cleaning this entire condo from top to bottom. I want the floors polished, the windows washed, and every single surface spotless. Then you are going to go to the high-end grocery store downtown and buy the most expensive ingredients they have in stock. You are cooking a massive feast for my entire extended family this coming Sunday evening. I want prime rib, I want lobster tails, and I want vintage champagne." I kept my expression perfectly neutral, even as the sheer audacity of his demands washed over me. He was ordering me to finance and prepare a luxury banquet to celebrate my own supposed defeat. "A feast for Sunday?" I asked, allowing a slight note of manufactured hesitation to enter my voice. "What exactly are we celebrating?" Brian smiled a terrifying, greedy smile that exposed the absolute worst parts of his character. He uncrossed his arms and slammed his hand flat against the kitchen island, making the heavy marble vibrate. "We are celebrating the absolute securing of my family legacy," he declared, his voice booming with arrogant pride. "I have spent the last few weeks orchestrating a massive financial maneuver that is going to elevate our wealth and status forever. I am finally taking my rightful place as the undisputed head of this family. I have secured an executive financial package that will change everything." He leaned closer to my face, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I am making a grand announcement at the dinner table this Sunday. It is going to be the most important moment of my entire life. My sister Pamela is coming. My niece Brittany will be there, and they are going to watch me step into a level of wealth you could not even begin to comprehend. You are going to make sure that dinner is absolutely flawless, Jillian. If the meat is overcooked or the champagne is warm, you will deeply regret it. This is my moment of triumph, and I will not allow you to ruin it with your typical incompetence." I looked at the man threatening me over the temperature of vintage champagne. He genuinely believed he was a criminal mastermind who had outsmarted the federal banking system. He was referring to the cash-out refinance loan as an executive financial package. He thought he had successfully forged my signature on federal mortgage documents and tricked a predatory lender into handing him $250,000 in cash. He planned to use that stolen equity to fund the offshore money laundering accounts he was filling with embezzled corporate funds. He was hosting a dinner to brag to his complicit sister about his success. He wanted to play the wealthy benefactor, handing out stolen money to his toxic relatives in my dining room. He wanted to sit at my table in a condo he did not legally own and tossed to his criminal brilliance. I lowered my eyes, playing the role of the subservient wife perfectly. "I understand, Brian," I said, my voice soft and accommodating. "I will go to the specialty butcher tomorrow morning to order the prime rib. I will make sure the crystal glasses are polished and the champagne is chilled exactly how you like it. I will ensure that this Sunday dinner is a night your family will never, ever forget." Brian let out a harsh, satisfied laugh. He reached out and patted me condescendingly on the cheek. "That is a good girl," he mocked. "See how much better things are when you just remember your place and follow directions? If you keep this up, I might actually let you stay in my condo after the renovations are finished." He turned his back on me and walked out of the kitchen, heading toward the master bedroom to change his clothes. He left his heavy leather briefcase sitting on my kitchen counter, a symbol of his supposed corporate dominance. I picked up the chef knife and resumed dicing the red pepper, allowing the ordinary rhythm of dinner preparation to hide my reaction. Brian had confirmed the only fact I needed from him Sunday evening was the moment he expected to display the refinance proceeds and declare himself the financial ruler of the family. I did not need to know every technical step yet. Mitchell and the lender's fraud team were handling the legal timing, and they would contact me once the application reached the final stage. For now, my task was simpler. I had to keep Brian confident. I agreed to the prime rib, the lobster, and the champagne because every detail of the celebration made him less suspicious. The more elaborate the dinner became, the more certain he would be that I had accepted my place beneath him. He would gather Pamela Brittany and the relatives who had applauded his cruelty into one room. He would describe the money in his own words. He would open the account himself. No one would have to guess what he believed he had done. The peppers hissed when they hit the hot oil. I watched the steam rise and imagined the dining room filled with his family, all of them waiting for a fortune built from forged documents and stolen corporate funds. Brian wanted a stage. I would give him one. What happened on that stage would depend entirely on the choices he made next. Saturday morning arrived with a brutal chill that settled over the city. But inside the condo, The air was thick with the sharp chemical scent of lemon polish and bleach. I had been awake since 4 o'clock, moving from room to room with a bucket and a scrub brush. Brian had demanded a spotless environment for his grand announcement, and I was determined to give him exactly what he asked for. Every baseboard was wiped down. Every pane of glass was polished until it reflected the cold winter light perfectly. I spent 2 solid hours on my hands and knees in a living room, carefully treating the fibers of the vintage Persian rug that anchored the seating area. By 10 o'clock, the entire luxury condominium was pristine. It looked like a photograph from an architectural magazine, devoid of any human mess or imperfection. I stood in the center of the living room, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my wrist, feeling a deep ache in my shoulders from the physical labor. I gathered my cleaning supplies and walked toward the kitchen, ready to start prepping the prime rib marinade. The heavy oak front door swung open with a loud thud. Brian and Brittany had gone out earlier that morning to pick up some last-minute items for the Sunday feast. I heard their loud voices echoing in the entryway. Brittany was complaining about the cold, and Brian was laughing, agreeing that they would soon be spending their winters somewhere tropical. I walked out of the kitchen and stopped dead in my tracks. Brittany had worn her heavy winter snow boots out into the slush and grime of the Chicago streets. Instead of taking them off at the entryway mat, she walked right past the tiled mudroom area. She stomped her feet deliberately onto the freshly polished hardwood floors, leaving a trail of gray, melting sludge in her wake. She did not stop there. She marched directly into the living room, making a straight line for the vintage Persian rug I had just spent hours cleaning. She stepped right onto the center of the delicate silk fibers and dragged her thick rubber soles across the intricate crimson pattern. Dark, muddy streaks ground deep into the fabric, instantly ruining my morning of exhaustive labor. She looked down at the mess she had just created and let out a loud theatrical gasp, pressing her hand to her chest in mock horror. "Oh my gosh, Jillian," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I completely forgot to take my boots off. The sidewalks outside are an absolute disaster right now. I guess I just tracked mud all over your clean floor." She looked up at me and smiled a wide, malicious grin that showed all her teeth. She was not sorry. She had timed it perfectly, waiting until she knew I had finished the deep cleaning to purposefully destroy it. I stared at the thick black mud settling into the expensive rug. A hot flash of pure rage ignited in my chest, threatening to break through my carefully constructed mask of submission. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her by her expensive winter coat and throw her out the front door into the freezing snow. But I forced my hands to remain relaxed at my sides. I focused on my breathing, keeping my face entirely blank. "I am sorry, Brittany," I said softly, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. "I will clean it up right away." Brian walked into the living room, shrugging off his heavy wool coat. He looked at the trail of mud stretching from the entryway to the center of the rug, and then he looked at me. He did not reprimand his niece. He did not tell her to take off her boots or apologize for ruining the morning cleaning. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest and leaned back against the doorframe, looking incredibly pleased with the situation. "You heard her, Jillian," he stated, his voice booming with arrogant authority. "You cannot just leave mud sitting on a rug like that. It will set and ruin the fibers permanently. You need to get back down there and scrub it out before it stains. We are hosting my entire family tomorrow, and I will not have them walking into a filthy house." Brittany kicked off her boots right there in the middle of the rug, leaving them sitting in a puddle of melting gray slush. She walked over to the custom velvet sofa and threw herself onto the cushions, pulling her phone out of her pocket. "Make sure you use the good fabric cleaner she ordered without looking up from her screen. I have allergies and I cannot stand the smell of the cheap stuff you were using earlier." I looked at Brian standing by the door, a smug, victorious smile plastered across his face. He was enforcing this humiliation, actively enjoying watching me swallow my pride and submit to the demands of a spoiled teenager. He truly believed he had broken my spirit entirely. He thought this was his new reality, a world where he was the undisputed king of a luxury castle built on stolen money, while his corporate executive wife scrubbed the floors at his command. I nodded slowly, keeping my gaze fixed on the floor. Right away, I murmured. I turned and walked slowly back to the kitchen, retrieving my bucket, the heavy bristle brush, and the specialized fabric cleaner. I filled the heavy bucket with hot soapy water, my bare hands steady and precise. The sharp physical degradation was biting, but it was also temporary. I meticulously cleaned the floor while mentally counting down the exact hours remaining until their absolute destruction. I carried the bucket back out to the living room and set it down next to the muddy boots. I got down on my hands and knees, the hard floor pressing uncomfortably into my joints. I dipped the brush into the hot water and applied the foaming cleaner directly to the dark sludge ground into the silk fibers. I began to scrub, moving the brush in tight, forceful circles. Brian walked over to the built-in bar and poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon. He took a slow sip, savoring the taste and the moment. "You know, Jillian," he said casually, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass, "it is actually good for you to do some real manual labor. People who work in offices all day forget what it takes to actually maintain a household. It builds character. It reminds you of where you came from." I scrubbed harder, watching the dark, muddy water foam up around the bristles of my brush. I kept my head down, hiding the dangerous spark in my eyes. "You are absolutely right, Brian," I whispered, keeping my tone submissive and small. "I appreciate the reminder." Brittany laughed, a sharp grating sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "She is right, Uncle Brian," she mocked. "Foster kids are used to getting their hands dirty. It is practically in her DNA. We are really doing her a favor by letting her stay here and keep the place tidy." I dunked my brush back into the bucket, watching the clear water turn murky and gray. I did not respond to the insult. I just let them gloat and laugh, and slowly drink their expensive bourbon in pure, absolute peace. I finished scrubbing the rug until the water ran clear. My knees throbbed from the hard floor, and my hands felt raw from the chemical cleaner. I carried the heavy bucket back to the kitchen, moving with deliberate slowness to maintain the illusion of physical defeat. Brian and Brittany did not even glance in my direction as I retreated. They were too busy discussing the high-end furniture they planned to purchase with their imminent wealth. I poured the murky gray water down the stainless steel sink, watching it swirl into the drain like the last remnants of their control over me. I washed my hands carefully, drying them on a clean towel before turning my attention to the massive prime rib resting on the counter. The culinary preparation required for the Sunday feast was extensive, but I welcomed the demanding physical labor. It kept my hands completely occupied and provided me a truly perfect excuse to remain entirely isolated. I began measuring the coarse sea salt, black pepper, and fresh rosemary for the dry rub. My motions were precise and methodical. Every crush of the mortar and pestle echoed the quiet rhythm of my racing heart. I coated the heavy cut of meat, pressing the herbs deep into the rich marbling. The aroma of garlic and rosemary filled the kitchen, masking the sharp chemical scent of the floor polish. From the living room, the sounds of their celebration continued unabated. Brian had poured a second round of his expensive bourbon and was currently lecturing his niece on the importance of aggressive financial strategy. He spoke with the unearned authority of a man who believed he had successfully outsmarted the entire federal banking system. He was outlining his vision for the future, detailing how he intended to leverage the condominium equity to expand his massive new international logistics empire. I placed the seasoned prime rib into the refrigerator and began wiping down the pristine marble countertops. The evening shadow stretched across the city skyline outside the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the condominium in deep shades of violet and gray. The transition from day to night brought a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The waiting was always the most agonizing part of any forensic audit. You gather the evidence, construct the trap, and then you simply have to sit in the quiet tension until the target makes their final, irrevocable move. At exactly 6:15, my smartwatch vibrated violently against my left wrist. It was not a standard notification. It was a rapid triple pulse sequence specifically programmed to bypass my Do Not Disturb settings. I froze, staring down at the glowing digital face of the watch. A single, highly encrypted text string suddenly illuminated the dark, small glass screen. The message read simply, Stage 4 active. The fraudulent cash-out refinance application had entered its final controlled review. The lender had activated the monitored status Mitchell told me to expect, ready to preserve Brian's next instructions without giving him unrestricted access to the money. My pulse quickened, but I forced my breathing to remain perfectly steady. I could not afford a single slip in my performance now. I picked up a damp cloth and walked to the edge of the kitchen island where I had a clear line of sight into the living room. Brian was leaning back on the custom velvet sofa, his feet resting casually on the glass coffee table. "I need to take inventory of the dry goods for tomorrow," I called out, keeping my tone subservient and soft. "I will be in the walk-in pantry for a few minutes, preparing the final baking list." Brian waved a dismissive hand in my direction, entirely unconcerned with my domestic chores. "Just make sure we have enough butter for the lobster tails," he demanded, without looking away from his television program. "Do not mess this up, Jillian." I nodded submissively and retreated silently into the deep walk-in pantry, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind me. The space was dark and quiet, insulated by thick walls lined with canned goods and baking supplies. The muffled sounds of the television instantly faded away, leaving me in near absolute silence. I reached beneath the bottom shelf, feeling for the small biometric lockbox I had secured there 3 days prior. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. The silent mechanism clicked open, revealing a specialized, highly encrypted black burner phone Mitchell had personally provided during our brief early morning meeting in his glass corner office. I powered on the device and dialed the priority line. Mitchell answered after 2 rings and patched in Agent Harris, the investigator, coordinating with the lender's fraud team. "We have the signal," Mitchell said. "The refinance application has reached its final review stage, and the lender has activated the monitoring protocol we discussed." Agent Harris explained that no unrestricted money had been released. Brian's application interface could display a provisional credit once the lender completed its automated checks, but the underlying transfer remained under controlled review. The fraud team had matched the forged signature against the trust records and flagged the destination accounts connected to Pamela and the offshore structure. Every instruction Brian issued from that point forward would be preserved. "So he may believe the money cleared," I said, "but he cannot actually take it." "Correct," Harris replied. "If he attempts to redirect the provisional funds, the lender will block the movement and retain the attempted transfer as evidence of intent. The connected accounts can then be restricted while investigators secure the relevant records. We are not sending real money into a laundering network, and we are not creating a crime that did not already exist. We are documenting what he chooses to do with an application built on forged documents." I leaned against the pantry wall and told them Brian planned to open his banking application at 7 the following evening, in front of the entire family. Mitchell said the timing gave counsel and investigators enough opportunity to complete their review. Agents would not enter the condo merely because the moment was dramatic. They would wait in the lobby only if the evidence approvals and warrants justified immediate action. Mitchell gave me one simple instruction. After Brian publicly acknowledged the refinance and attempted to use or redirect the funds, I would send a short confirmation from the secure phone. I was not to touch his device, suggest a destination account, or provoke him into making the transfer. If he became violent, I was to leave the condo and call local police immediately. I repeated the protocol back to them, then ended the call and returned the burner phone to the lockbox. For the first time, the trap felt precise rather than theatrical. The lender was protecting its money, investigators were preserving Brian's choices, and my only responsibility was to remain safe and tell the truth about what I witnessed. Everything after that would proceed through formal channels, not through improvisation inside my dining room. Sunday arrived beneath a low gray sky. I spent the morning completing the meal, checking the cameras and removing anything from the common rooms that could become dangerous if Brian lost control. The prime rib rested at the proper temperature, the lobster tails were prepared, and the champagne chilled in the wine refrigerator exactly as he had demanded. From the outside, the condo looked ready for a celebration. Underneath that polished surface, every relevant document had been copied, every recording system was active, and Mitchell knew the dinner schedule. Brian moved through the rooms with restless excitement, repeatedly checking his phone and rehearsing fragments of his announcement. Brittany changed outfits 3 times while discussing photographs she planned to post from Europe. Neither of them noticed how carefully I watched the clock. By late afternoon, the light beyond the windows had faded into a steel-colored haze. The guests were due at 7, but Pamela had never respected anyone else's schedule. I was wiping the spotless marble counters when the stove clock moved to 5 and the front door flew open. I was still in the kitchen, wiping down the spotless marble counters just to look busy. Brian did not even turn his head from the television screen. Pamela burst into the entryway like a hurricane of cheap perfume and unearned arrogance. She was a full 2 hours early for the scheduled dinner. Her arms were weighed down by nearly a dozen shopping bags from high-end designer boutiques. The crisp paper rustled loudly as she kicked the door shut behind her. She dropped the bags onto the bench with a dramatic sigh. She marched directly into the living room, blocking Brian's view of the television. "Look at everything I got today!" she squealed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The boutique is doing so incredibly well that I decided to treat myself to a little early celebration." Brian finally looked away from the television and smiled at his sister. He stood up and gave her a tight hug, completely ignoring my presence in the kitchen. "You deserve it, Pamela," he told her, clapping her on the shoulder. "Today is a massive day for this family, and we are going to celebrate properly." Pamela turned her head and finally looked at me, standing quietly in the kitchen. Her smile dissolved into a flat line of pure contempt. "Jillian," she barked, snapping her fingers in my direction like I was a disobedient dog. "Come upstairs with me right now. I need to fix my makeup and I want to talk to you in private before the rest of the guests arrive." I kept my face perfectly blank and nodded submissively. Brian sat back down on the velvet sofa, completely unbothered by his sister ordering me around in my own home. I dried my hands on a dish towel and followed Pamela up the polished wooden staircase. She walked with heavy, aggressive steps, leaving a trail of cold air and entitlement in her wake. We reached the master bedroom and she pushed the door open, stepping inside and immediately walking over to my vanity. She did not bother looking in the mirror to check her makeup. The moment I stepped into the room and closed the door behind me, her entire demeanor shifted from obnoxious gloating to venomous hostility. She crossed her arms over her chest and glared at me. "You have been making my niece absolutely miserable," she stated, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Brittany told me that you have been nothing but a dark cloud hanging over this entire condo. She said you are constantly giving her dirty looks and making her feel unwelcome in her own uncle's house." I kept my head slightly bowed, maintaining the illusion of a defeated woman. "I have been cleaning and cooking all day, Pamela," I replied softly. "I have not done anything to upset Brittany." Pamela scoffed loudly, taking a step closer to me. Her eyes darted over to my jewelry box sitting on the corner of the dresser. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at the wooden chest. You owe that poor girl a massive apology and a peace offering for the emotional damage you have caused her, Pamela demanded. I want you to open that box and give me your grandmother's vintage diamond earrings. Brittany has a school formal coming up next month, and those earrings will match her dress perfectly. It is the absolute least you can do after treating her like a burden all week. The sheer audacity of her demand made my breath catch in my throat. She was demanding a priceless family heirloom that had been passed down through 3 generations of my family, just to appease a spoiled teenager who had intentionally tracked winter mud across my clean rug. Those earrings belong to my grandmother, I said, my voice trembling slightly as I injected just the right amount of fake panic into my tone. I cannot give those away, Pamela. They are the only thing I have left of her. They mean everything to me. Pamela sneered, stepping entirely into my personal space until I could smell the stale coffee on her breath. You do not have anything left, Jillian, she threatened, stepping closer. Brian is taking this condo. He is taking everything. You are going to be out on the street. If you do not hand over those earrings right now, I will march downstairs and tell Brian that you screamed at me, Pamela hissed. I will tell him you are trying to ruin his grand announcement tonight. He will throw you out into the snow before the prime rib is even finished cooking. I took a deliberate step backward, feigning absolute terror. Please, do not do that, I begged, holding my hands up defensively. Pamela saw my strategic retreat as a victory. She lunged past me, moving with surprising speed, and grabbed the heavy wooden lid of my jewelry box. She yanked it open violently, causing several delicate necklaces to spill out onto the polished wood of the dresser top. She began digging her hands through the velvet compartments, tearing through my personal belongings with greedy force. I reached out and caught her wrist intentionally, guiding her hand away from the hidden bottom compartment, where the vintage heirloom diamonds were safely secured. Do not touch my things, I cried out, feigning desperation. She shoved my shoulder hard enough to make me stumble backward against the heavy wooden bed frame. Do not ever put your hands on me, you pathetic loser, she spat, twisting with rage. Her fingers blindly grasped a small black velvet pouch resting in the top tray. She yanked it out and opened the drawstring triumphantly. Inside the pouch rested a pair of simple diamond studs. They were expensive, but nothing compared to the priceless heirloom earrings tucked safely away beneath the false bottom of the box. Pamela did not know the difference. Her eyes lit up with greedy satisfaction as she examined the stones in her hand. These will do perfectly, she declared, shoving the pouch deep into the pocket of her designer cardigan. Consider this a minor tax for your miserable behavior. If you tell Brian, I will deny everything, and he will believe me over you. She slammed the lid of the jewelry box shut, causing a loud crack to echo. She turned and marched toward the door, throwing her shoulders back in victory. You better get back downstairs and make sure dinner is flawless, Jillian, she ordered without looking back. My brother is about to be wealthy, and I will not let you ruin our celebration. She opened the door and marched down the hallway, leaving me alone in the quiet suite. The moment the door shut, the expression of fearful submission completely melted off my face. I stood up straight and brushed dust off my sweater. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the small alarm clock resting on the bedside table. The hidden lens behind the digital display had just captured every single second of the encounter. It recorded her aggressive threats, her physical assault, and the undeniable felony theft of my diamond jewelry. She had just added severe criminal charges to her impending federal indictment. I smiled, a cold, brilliant smile into the hidden camera. Pamela had handed me the final nail for her coffin. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 7, just as the heavy doorbell rang, echoing loudly through the pristine condominium. I smoothed my white apron and walked slowly to the entryway, pasting a polite, subservient smile onto my face. Brian stood by the built-in bar, pouring himself another glass of bourbon, completely ignoring the arriving guests. I opened the heavy oak door to welcome his extended family. Two of his uncles arrived first, followed by a handful of loud cousins who immediately began admiring the expensive decor and the sweeping, gorgeous night views of the cold Chicago skyline. The atmosphere shifted the exact moment they stepped inside, becoming thick with an unearned arrogance that mirrored Brian perfectly. They handed me their heavy winter coats without looking me in the eye, treating me less like a family member and more like hired help. I hung the coats in the mudroom closet, moving with quiet efficiency while they gathered in the bright living room. Pamela emerged from the upstairs hallway, her earlier rage replaced by a smug, victorious glow. She had reapplied her makeup and changed into a different designer outfit, clearly eager to play the wealthy family matriarch. She swept into the large room, accepting compliments from the uncles and completely ignoring my quiet presence. Brian took his place at the head of the massive dining room table, signaling that it was time to begin the feast. He did not ask anyone to sit, he simply expected them to follow his lead. The family scrambled to take their seats around the polished mahogany table, laughing loudly at a terrible joke one of the cousins made. Jillian Brian barked loudly, snapping his thick fingers in my direction. "Stop standing around and immediately fetch the prepared drinks for us. We need the vintage champagne brought out right now, and make sure the crystal glasses are chilled perfectly." I nodded, keeping my gaze lowered, and hurried back into the spotless kitchen. I retrieved the heavy crystal flutes and the expensive bottles of champagne, carefully carrying them to the dining room on a large silver tray. I moved around the long table, pouring the bubbling liquid for each seated guest. When I reached Brittany, she held her glass up higher deliberately, making it difficult for me to pour without spilling. She smirked at me, her dark eyes daring me directly. She wanted me to make a mistake, but my hands remained perfectly steady. I filled her glass and moved on, ignoring her childish attempt at cruel sabotage. Once everyone was served, Brian stood up, holding his crystal flute high in the air. "I want to propose a very important toast," Brian announced, his booming voice, demanding absolute silence from the entire room. "To family wealth and absolute loyalty." He locked eyes with Pamela, who raised her glass in return, a greedy smile stretching across her face. "We have always known that this family was destined for pure greatness," Brian continued, looking around the room. "We have always understood what it takes to succeed in a world that tries to hold us back. Tonight we are not just celebrating a wonderful meal, we are celebrating a massive shift in our legacy. We are stepping into a new era of absolute financial dominance, and I am incredibly proud to lead us there." The family erupted in loud cheers, clinking their expensive crystal glasses together and taking long sips of the vintage champagne. I stood quietly in the corner of the dining room, holding the empty silver serving tray. I was pressing my fingernails into my palms to keep my expression completely blank. They were toasting to their own destruction, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was already crumbling rapidly. "Fetch the first course," Jillian Brian ordered, sitting back down heavily in his wooden chair. "And clear these dirty appetizer plates." I moved back and forth between the kitchen and the dining room, carrying heavy platters of perfectly roasted prime rib, buttered lobster tails, and steaming side dishes. The physical labor was extremely exhausting, but the rhythmic, repetitive motion kept my mind totally focused and calm. I served Brian first, placing the thickest cut of meat directly in front of him. He did not offer a single word of thanks, simply picking up his knife and cutting into the expensive beef. The dining room filled with the sounds of chewing and loud, obnoxious conversation. They talked over each other, bragging about recent purchases and planned tropical vacations, acting as though the massive wealth Brian had promised was already sitting in their bank accounts. I cleared the empty plates, moving silently behind their chairs, listening to every word of their delusional and arrogant family celebrations. Pamela leaned across the large table, pointing her silver fork directly at Brian. "So, little brother," she purred, her voice thick with dark anticipation, "are you finally going to tell everyone the exact details of this grand announcement? You have been keeping us in terrible suspense all week long." Brian chewed his food slowly, deliberately, dragging out the moment for maximum dramatic effect. He took another long sip of champagne and wiped his mouth with a crisp linen napkin. He placed the napkin on the table and leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, projecting absolute control. "I suppose the right time has come," he declared, looking around the table at the eager faces of his relatives. "As you all know, I have been working on a highly complex executive financial package for the last month. It required absolute precision and a deep understanding of corporate equity structures." He paused briefly, glancing in my direction with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "It also required navigating around certain frustrating obstacles and ensuring that dead weight did not drag down our family potential." The uncles chuckled knowingly, and Brittany let out a sharp and mean teenage laugh. I kept my face entirely expressionless, quietly gathering empty water glasses onto my silver tray. "I have officially finalized a massive digital transfer," Brian continued, his voice rising with intense excitement. "I have leveraged the hidden assets of this luxury property and secured $250,000 in pure, liquid cash." The entire room gasped in perfect unison. Pamela dropped her heavy fork onto her china plate, her eyes wide with total shock and absolute greed. $250,000? She repeated breathlessly, staring at her brother. "That is absolutely correct," Brian stated incredibly proudly. $250,000 completely cleared and ready to be deployed into our new offshore logistics accounts. This is the seed money that will grow our family empire into something completely untouchable. He stood up from his chair, unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket and reaching into his inner chest pocket. He pulled out his sleek smartphone, holding it up high for everyone to clearly see. The digital transaction was scheduled to clear the final bank underwriting process just a few short moments ago, he announced. "I am going to open my personal banking application right now and show you the newly cleared cash balance." Pamela leaned closer to him, practically vibrating with uncontrollable greed and excitement. Brian tapped the screen and looked confidently down at the display. The victorious smile vanished from his face instantly. He stared at the screen, trapped in a sudden nightmare. The banking interface was locked firmly behind a flashing red notification that simply read, "Account frozen. Contact federal authorities immediately." The dining room fell into a suffocating silence as Brian stared at the glowing screen of his smartphone. The triumphant color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow ghost of the arrogant man who had just delivered a toast to his own criminal genius. His hand began to tremble slightly, causing the red warning text to blur in his vision. Pamela leaned closer, her brow furrowing in deep confusion as she tried to read the small screen. "What is it, Brian?" she asked, her voice tight with sudden anxiety. "Is there a technical glitch with the bank transfer?" Brian could not formulate a response. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. He just kept tapping the screen frantically, hoping the terrifying federal alert would magically vanish and be replaced by his stolen fortune while the entire extended family focused their confused attention entirely on Brian and his malfunctioning mobile application. I made my move. I reached behind my back and untied the tight knot of my white catering apron. I pulled it over my head and let the stained fabric fall carelessly onto the pristine hardwood floor right next to my feet. I rolled my shoulders back, releasing the subservient posture I had maintained all evening. Moving with deliberate and unhurried grace, I walked past the shocked relatives and pulled out the heavy mahogany chair at the direct opposite end of the long dining table. I sat down, smoothing my dark skirt, and folded my hands neatly, resting them on the polished wood. The loud scrape of the heavy wooden chair against the floor finally broke Brian out of his paralyzed state of pure panic. His head snapped up, his eyes darting frantically down the length of the table until they locked directly onto me. The sheer confusion on his face quickly morphed back into his default expression of aggressive rage. "What do you think you are doing, Jillian?" he barked, his voice cracking slightly under the immense stress of his financial crisis. "Get out of that chair and get back into the kitchen right now. We have guests waiting for dessert, and you have dirty plates to wash." I did not flinch. I did not lower my gaze. I simply reached out and picked up the expensive crystal wine glass resting unused in front of my designated setting. I took a slow, appreciative sip of the vintage red wine, savoring the rich flavor and the absolute power of this specific moment. I set the crystal glass back down with a firm click that echoed loudly in the tense room. "I think it is time we talk about who actually owns this table, Brian," I stated, my voice projecting calm authority that completely silenced his commanding tone. The uncles exchanged bewildered glances, while Brittany let out a loud, dramatic sigh of pure annoyance. "Uncle Brian, tell her to stop acting crazy and get us our cake," Brittany whined, crossing her arms over her designer dress. I ignored the spoiled teenager completely. Without breaking eye contact with my husband, I reached beneath the edge of the dining table and retrieved the thick, heavy leather portfolio I had secured there earlier that afternoon. I lifted the heavy folder and let it drop directly onto the center of the polished mahogany table with a loud, commanding thud. The thick stack of official legal documentation spilled out across the wood, displaying multiple pages of notarized signatures and heavy federal seals. "What is this garbage?" Brian demanded, attempting to maintain his crumbling facade of absolute control. "Did you completely lose your mind? I am the sole beneficiary and the exclusive legal owner of this entire luxury property," I announced, my voice steady and crystal clear so every single relative could hear the absolute truth. "I have always owned it. The deed, the title, and the foundational trust are all exclusively registered in my name through an impenetrable corporate holding company established long before we ever met. This home was never yours to leverage, Brian. You never possessed a single ounce of equity in these walls." Pamela let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at the official documents scattered across the table. "That is absolutely impossible," she sputtered, looking frantically between me and her brother. "Brian told us he bought this place with his own corporate bonuses. He said his name was on the master deed." "Brian lied to you, Pamela," I said. "He also lied to the lender when he forged my signature and claimed authority over an asset he had never been permitted to use." I turned back to Brian. "I did not know every detail when you ordered me out on Tuesday, but the $60,000 transfer gave me a starting point. From there, your own records led me to the refinance application, the false vendors, the offshore accounts, and the payments routed through Pamela's boutique. I never needed to plant documents or invent evidence. Your arrogance supplied everything. You signed the application, saved the messages, approved the invoices, and chose the destination accounts. The lender did not give you unrestricted control of $250,000. Its fraud team placed the proposed transfer under review and preserved every instruction you issued. The red warning means the movement has been blocked, and the connected accounts frozen for investigation." Pamela's face went slack. Brittany stopped smirking. Their renovations, vacation, and shopping money depended on funds Brian could never lawfully obtain. I let the silence settle. This condo was never yours to mortgage, Brian. The money was never yours to move. And the people waiting downstairs are here because your own actions gave them a case. I watched the pure, unadulterated smugness literally melt right off Pamela and Brittany. Their arrogant faces contorted into masks of pure, absolute horror. The massive, unearned wealth they had spent the entire week bragging about was completely gone. The luxurious tropical vacations, the expensive designer shopping sprees, and the grand offshore business empires were nothing but digital smoke. Brittany grabbed her smartphone, her hands shaking violently as she frantically tried to check her own linked banking application, hoping to find the promised bonus money. She stared at her screen and let out a strangled sob, realizing her accounts were just as empty as her future. Pamela slumped back in her chair, looking physically ill, as she realized she was now heavily implicated in a massive federal financial crime. "You have absolutely nothing, Brian," I whispered into the deafening silence of the dining room. "You never did. Now the federal authorities are waiting downstairs in the lobby to take it all away." The words hung in the stale air of the dining room like a physical weight. For a long, unbroken minute, nobody dared to take a single breath. Brian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, as his brain desperately tried to process the absolute destruction of his reality. Then something shifted in his eyes. The sheer animal panic was suddenly replaced by a frantic, desperate need to regain control of his audience. He let out a loud, forced bark of laughter that echoed unnaturally against the high ceiling. He straightened his posture and aggressively adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored suit jacket, projecting a completely fabricated aura of unbothered confidence. "Is that really supposed to frighten me, Jillian?" he asked, his voice dripping with forced condescension. "You think owning this single piece of real estate gives you some sort of ultimate power over my life?" He turned away from me and looked directly at his sister and his niece, who were both still frozen in their chairs. "Do not listen to a single word this crazy woman is saying," he instructed them, waving his thick hand dismissively in my direction. "She is just being pathetic and vindictive because she knows I am leaving her." Pamela looked at him, her eyes wide, with a mixture of terror and desperate hope, wanting to believe his sudden pivot. Brian paced slowly behind his heavy wooden chair, puffing out his chest and acting as though he was addressing a corporate boardroom rather than a shattered family dinner. "So you kept the condo," he declared, shaking his head with a mock sigh of pity. "Congratulations, Jillian. You get to keep this empty box in the sky. I do not need this mortgage money, and I certainly do not need your stupid property. I am a senior executive director at one of the most profitable international logistics firms in the entire country. My corporate salary alone makes me the absolute breadwinner of this family." He slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table, causing the fine china plates to rattle violently. "I generate real wealth every single day," he boomed his voice, rising with manic energy. "If you want to kick us out into the cold, then go right ahead. I will simply take my massive executive income and I will buy my real blood family a brand new house tomorrow morning. I will buy Pamela and Brittany a sprawling estate in the most exclusive suburb in the state. We will have a mansion that makes this little apartment look like a joke. You can sit here all by yourself and rot while we move on to bigger and better things." He finished his grand declaration with a smug, victorious smirk plastered across his sweating face. He truly believed he had successfully salvaged his ego and provided his family with a flawless exit strategy. His uncles nodded slowly, exchanging relieved glances, while Brittany let out a massive sigh and crossed her arms, glaring at me with renewed teenage arrogance. I let the silence stretch out, allowing his desperate illusions to fully settle into the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger or frustration. I simply reached down beneath the edge of the dining table for the second time that evening. My fingers wrapped around the thick, cold plastic of a heavy black binder. I lifted it slowly and placed it onto the polished wood directly next to the property deeds. The heavy thud of the binder hitting the table instantly wiped the arrogant smirk right off his face. I pressed my fingertips against the dark plastic cover and slid the heavy folder straight down the center of the long table. It glided smoothly over the polished wood and came to a sudden halt, stopping mere inches from his empty dinner plate. He stared down at the black binder as if it were a live explosive device. His breathing became shallow and rapid, his chest heaving under his expensive shirt. "You are right about one thing, Brian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling murmur that commanded absolute attention from every single person in the room. "You do generate a massive amount of wealth at your international logistics firm. But unfortunately for you, your corporate salary was never quite enough to satisfy your endless greed." I watched his eyes dart frantically toward the black folder. "You see, I have spent the last several days conducting a complete forensic financial autopsy of your professional life," I continued, maintaining unwavering eye contact with him. "Inside that folder are the completely cloned and perfectly verified corporate financial logs from your logistics firm. I have tracked every single digital dollar." I detailed with chilling precision exactly how he had been establishing dummy vendor accounts and silently embezzling massive sums of money directly from the corporate treasury. I explained how he had been approving fake invoices for international shipping containers that did not actually exist. The room grew so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. "But the most interesting part of your little criminal enterprise was the money laundering operation," I stated, casually leaning back in my chair. "You needed a way to clean that stolen corporate cash so it would not trigger any internal audits." I slowly shifted my gaze away from Brian and looked directly into Pamela's horrified eyes. "And that is exactly where your high-end designer boutique came into play, Pamela." Pamela gasped sharply, her hands flying to her throat as the blood completely drained from her face. "I tracked the wire transfers Brian pushed through your boutique business accounts," I explained softly. "You have been processing fake luxury inventory sales to wash his stolen corporate funds for over 2 years. You allowed your own brother to turn your legitimate small business into a federal money laundering machine." Brittany let out a terrified whimper, finally realizing the absolute severity of the situation. Her mother was not just losing a free designer wardrobe, she was going to federal prison for a very long time. Brian grabbed the edge of the table, his legs giving out beneath him as he collapsed heavily into his chair and stared blankly ahead. He was physically shaking his mouth open in a silent scream of total defeat. His entire fabricated empire had been completely dismantled piece by piece right in front of his extended family, who watched in horror. "You do not have an executive salary to fall back on now, Brian," I concluded, my voice perfectly steady. "The Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation have had those verified files for several days." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and suffocating. It was as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the expansive dining room, leaving the extended family choking on the toxic fumes of their ruined ambitions. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. They sat frozen around the mahogany table, staring at the heavy black binder resting near Brian like it was a venomous snake about to strike. Then the paralysis broke, and the entire room imploded with spectacular violence. Pamela was the first to shatter. The smug, aristocratic matriarch facade she had worn all evening violently dissolved into a mask of pure, animalistic terror. She let out a piercing, guttural shriek that echoed off the high ceilings, sounding like a wounded bird. She pushed her heavy wooden chair back so forcefully, it tipped over and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor. She scrambled away from the table, her hands pulling frantically at her own hair, as the horrific reality of federal prison finally penetrated her greed. "I did not know anything," she screamed, her voice cracking hysterically as she backed away from her brother. "I did not know where that cash was coming from, Brian. You told me it was legitimate corporate bonus money. You told me it was clean." She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at him, throwing him under the metaphorical bus without a single second of hesitation. "You manipulated me into this, you lying sociopath. You used my boutique. You ruined my entire life. I will tell the federal agents everything. I will tell them you forced me to process those fake luxury inventory sales. I am not going to a federal prison for your pathetic embezzlement scheme." The extended family erupted into total chaos around her. The uncles who had just been toasting to Brian were now shouting over each other, desperately trying to distance themselves from the fallout. They shoved their chairs away from the table, abandoning their half-eaten prime rib and expensive champagne, as if the food itself was suddenly contaminated. Brittany ignored her mother completely. She did not care about the money laundering or the potential criminal charges facing her family. Her mind was entirely consumed by her own selfish vanity. She slammed her fist down onto the table, causing the crystal water glasses to rattle and spill over the fine linen tablecloth. "What about my European vacation?" she shrieked, her face turning a blotchy, furious shade of red. "Uncle Brian promised me a first-class ticket to Paris for spring break. He promised me a $10,000 shopping allowance." She glared aggressively around the panicking room, demanding answers from people who were currently watching their entire lives disintegrate. "Someone has to pay for my trip," she demanded, stamping her foot against the floor like a petulant toddler throwing a tantrum in a toy store. "My friends are already expecting me to post pictures from the Eiffel Tower. Who is going to give me the money for my vacation?" Her shrieking entitlement only added to the deafening cacophony of the imploding family dinner. I sat perfectly still at the end of the long table, watching them tear each other to absolute shreds. I did not need to raise my voice or defend myself anymore. The trap had been flawlessly executed, and they were doing all the destructive work for me. Brian remained completely paralyzed in his chair at the head of the table. His expensive, custom-tailored suit jacket was entirely soaked with nervous sweat. His breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps, and his eyes darted wildly around the room, watching his sister scream threats and his niece throw a childish fit. The arrogant illusion of the untouchable corporate executive had been entirely stripped away, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, hollow little boy who had finally been caught stealing from the cookie jar. He slowly lifted his head and looked down the length of the polished wood until his bloodshot eyes locked onto mine. He saw the cold, absolute calm radiating from my posture. He saw the undeniable truth that I held every single card and that his entire future rested solely in the palms of my hands. His legs finally gave out. He slid out of his heavy dining chair, moving with awkward, jerky motions, and collapsed directly onto the hardwood floor. He crawled around the edge of the large table, his expensive trousers catching on the edge of the fallen chairs. He dragged himself across the floor, stopping right next to the exact spot where I had dropped my white catering apron just moments ago. He fell forward onto his knees, pressing his hands against the floorboards, looking up at me from the exact subservient physical position he had demanded I occupy for the entirety of our marriage. His face was slick with sweat and tears mingling together in a pathetic display of absolute desperation. "Jillian, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, wet sob. "Please, you have to stop this. You are a forensic accountant. You know how to manipulate the digital ledgers. You know how to hide the money trails." He reached out with a trembling hand, desperately trying to grasp the hem of my dark skirt, but I slowly pulled my legs back, keeping myself entirely out of his reach. "You can fix the corporate logs, Jillian," he pleaded, his chest heaving as he sobbed openly in front of his horrified, screaming relatives. "You can hack into the federal reporting protocols and erase the digital footprints. I know you can do it. You are the smartest woman I have ever met. Please, Jillian, I am your husband. You promised to stand by me. We can fix the boutique accounts. We can put the stolen money back into the corporate treasury before the federal agents finalize their audit. Just log into your computer and erase the cloned files. I will give you anything you want. I will give you the condo. I will sign whatever trust documents you want me to sign. Just please do not let them take me to prison. I will be a better husband. I promise I will be a better man." I looked down at the pathetic creature kneeling at my feet. The contrast between the arrogant man who demanded I fetch his champagne and this groveling mess was profound. I felt nothing but a pure, satisfying sense of absolute justice. I placed my hands on the polished table and pushed myself up from my chair. I stood tall, projecting a complete and untouchable authority. I stared into his terrified eyes, delivering the final verbal blow with surgical precision. "I don't fix frauds, Brian. I report them." The finality of my words struck him like a physical blow, sending a violent shudder down his spine. Before Brian could even draw another ragged breath to beg for mercy, heavy, authoritative knocks echoed loudly through the silent hallway of the condominium. The sharp, demanding sound shattered the suffocating tension in the dining room. The extended family members who were still cowering near the overturned chairs jumped in unison, their eyes darting frantically toward the front entryway. Brian remained frozen on his knees, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute terror as the knocking came again, louder and more insistent now. Federal agents opened the door. Immediately, a deep, commanding voice boomed through the thick oak wood. I smoothed my dark skirt, turning my back on my groveling husband, and walked with measured, unhurried steps toward the foyer. I reached out and unlocked the heavy door, pulling it wide to reveal a team of local police officers and stern-faced federal agents standing in the brightly lit corridor. Their badges gleamed under the recessed lighting, projecting an aura of absolute authority. "We are looking for Brian and Pamela," they announced, stepping past me into the pristine luxury condo entryway space. I simply nodded and gestured calmly toward the dining room. The agents moved swiftly and decisively, storming into the dining area with purposeful strides. Brian tried to scramble backward away from them, but his legs tangled in the expensive fabric of his tailored trousers. An agent grabbed his arms, hauling him roughly to his feet before forcing his hands behind his back. Brian let out a pathetic whimpering sound as the cold steel handcuffs clicked securely into place around his wrists. "You are under arrest for massive corporate embezzlement and multiple counts of federal mortgage fraud," the lead agent recited. He continued reading him his rights firmly as Brian hung his head in total, complete defeat. Across the large room, Pamela let out a piercing shriek as two female officers approached her. "Get your hands off me! I am a respected business owner!" she screamed, thrashing wildly as they moved to secure her wrists. "You are being detained for questioning regarding the intentional laundering of stolen corporate funds through your boutique business accounts," the officer informed her sharply. "And we will also be asking you about the stolen diamond earrings currently residing inside your expensive designer purse right now." Pamela froze completely, her face turning a sickly shade of gray as the reality of her impending incarceration finally crushed her arrogant spirit. As the officers marched the struggling criminals toward the front door, the rest of the extended family scrambled to get out of the way, terrified of being implicated in the massive federal sweep. Amidst the chaos, Brittany threw herself dramatically onto the hardwood floor, kicking her legs and pounding her fists against the polished wood. She was sobbing hysterically, her expensive mascara running down her blotchy red cheeks in thick, dark streaks, ruining her makeup completely. "But what about me?" she shrieked at the top of her lungs, ignoring the fact that her mother and uncle were currently being dragged away in handcuffs. "Who is going to wash my clothes every single week? Who is going to make my breakfast and pay my expensive college tuition? You cannot just leave me here without any money." The sheer, entitled audacity of her childish tantrum echoed through the ruined dinner party, perfectly encapsulating the toxic, parasitic nature of their entire family. The federal agents paused briefly, glancing down at the sobbing teenager, with expressions of pure, absolute disgust. They continued pulling Brian and Pamela out into the hallway, ignoring the wailing girl entirely. I walked slowly over to where Brittany lay thrashing on the floor. I stood directly over her, my shadow falling across her tear-stained face. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with desperate expectation, still somehow believing that I would step in and fix her ruined life just like I always had before. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of peaceful closure. "Try the prison laundromat," I whispered softly, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. "I hear they're taking applications." Brittany let out a strangled gasp, her face contorting in fresh horror as she finally understood that the free ride was permanently over. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her uncles quietly ushered her out of the condominium, eager to escape the disastrous evening. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind the last departing relative, plunging the massive luxury property into a deep, satisfying silence. The suffocating weight of their unearned arrogance and endless demands vanished completely, leaving behind a crisp, clean atmosphere that I could finally breathe in. Over the months that followed, their fabricated empire collapsed under the evidence they had created themselves. The federal investigation moved with brutal efficiency, armed with the meticulously organized files and cloned digital ledgers I had provided. Brian and Pamela quickly realized they had absolutely no defense against the mountain of irrefutable evidence stacked against them. They were both indicted on multiple severe federal charges. The arrogant corporate executive and the smug boutique owner were permanently stripped of their stolen wealth and sentenced to serve significant time in high-security federal prison facilities far away. Their names were ruined. Their assets were seized, and their legacy was reduced to a cautionary tale of greed and absolute foolishness. Brittany, entirely cut off from the stolen corporate funds and the luxury lifestyle she felt so entitled to, was forced to immediately drop out of her expensive university. Without my financial support or her mother to indulge her endless demands, she had to move into a tiny cramped apartment and take a grueling minimum wage job just to survive. The reality of hard manual labor and a strict budget hit her like a massive, heavy freight train now. It forced her to finally learn the true value of a dollar the hardest way possible. As for me, I reclaimed my life and my peaceful sanctuary. I hired a professional cleaning service to scrub away the last, lingering traces of their toxic presence from my beautiful home. My forensic accounting career flourished, my reputation completely untouched by the criminal scandal I had expertly exposed. I spent my evenings exactly how I wanted, without answering to anyone or catering to ungrateful demands. I walked through the quiet, pristine living room and slid open the heavy glass door smoothly and quietly. I stood on the balcony of my luxury condo sipping wine in total peace, having successfully defended my empire and eradicated the toxic parasites completely. Standing alone in the quiet condo, I understood that peace was not something Brian or his relatives had ever been capable of giving me. It came from refusing to surrender my dignity merely to preserve the appearance of a family. I had spent years believing patience could turn disrespect into love. Instead, boundaries and evidence had finally done what patience could not. The home around me was unchanged, but it no longer felt like a stage on which I had to prove my worth. It was mine again in every sense that mattered. Share your experiences in the comments below about a time you had to redefine what family means to you after a painful betrayal. If this lesson resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more incredible stories of resilience and self-discovery.